high school, and very soon thereafter, my family moved to Montgomery. And later, I took some courses at Jones Law School. Very soon thereafter, I was married, and my mother-in-law knew the legal advisor to Governor Graves, Governor Bibb Graves, and she talked to her husband about my being employed in the Capitol, and Mr. Lawrence Lee talked to Governor Bibb Graves, and Governor Bibb Graves talked to the Secretary of State, Mr. John Brandon, and he talked to me, and I was employed in the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State's office, of course, has always been my heart. While I have been elected to other offices, I've always loved the Secretary of State's office.
Okay. What was Montgomery like when you first came here? Could you describe Montgomery for us?
The best impression I have of the city of Montgomery, of the beautiful trees along Perry Street, particularly go many blocks on Perry Street, the trees were so beautiful. But an interesting thing to me has always been, in Columbus, Georgia, there was a transfer station, which is, the station was in the heart of Columbus, Georgia. At that time, they had a common going down the middle of the main street, and on each side were the streets and the business establishments. People going to downtown would board a streetcar and go to the transfer station. If they wanted to transfer there, they'd get a ticket and go wherever they wanted, or they could sit there and wait for friends. So many people would say, "I'll wait for you at the transfer station." When I came to Montgomery, I looked around, and I didn't see a transfer station. Well, to me, a transfer station is just as important as a railroad depot, but there was no transfer station in Montgomery. But that didn't deter me from loving Montgomery, and I have enjoyed, and I'm faithful and a patriot for Montgomery, Alabama.
Okay, can you tell us?
We're rolling.
Okay. You told us a little bit about your coming to the Secretary of State's office. What year was that?
Way back there in the early 20s, in 1927, I came to work in the Secretary of State's office. I was so proud of being an employee in the Secretary of State's office. The work, to me, was interesting every step of the way. There was something moving every day, and I was interested in everything that went on in the Secretary of State's office. I remember that when I first came into the Capitol, I was in a hurry to get to the office. I was interested in what was going on, and an old guide in the rotunda stopped me. He had a white hair and a white beard, and he says, "Honey, I see you coming in this building like a house afire. Don't you do that. This Capitol's going to be here long after you're dead and gone." I have many just lovely memories about the Office of Secretary of State. I think that our viewers would like to know some of the interesting things that we have. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that when a college, a university, desires to change the name, they must first come to the Secretary of State's office to get a certificate under the statute before they can change the name. And I remember Woman's College changing its name to Huntington College. And someone came to our office to obtain a certificate, making it possible for them to change the name from Woman's College to Huntington. One time, the town of Benton, if you remember, the town of Benton became, well, almost a ghost town. It was unincorporated. They wanted to establish Dan River Mills there. And this gentleman came to the Secretary of State's office in later years and wanted to reincorporate the town of Benton. It was necessary that they come to the Secretary of State and get the proper papers in order to reincorporate the town of Benton. exciting things like that. I have enjoyed the Secretary of State's office. But first, I want to tell you about the beauty of our Capitol complex. The Capitol complex is beautiful in its simplicity. People all over, tourists, certainly come to the Capitol, and many express themselves as saying it is one of the most beautiful capitals in the United States. It is. The Capitol building, to me, is where all the offices were located a long time ago. The Supreme Court was located there, the Court of Appeals, the Governor's office, the Secretary of State's office across from the Governor. And all of the work going on, the departments were housed in the main Capitol building. Now, of course, they are renovating the Capitol building, and I know it will be beautiful. I don't know whether the offices will return to the main Capitol building. Beautiful spiral stairway that people say is very unusual. Before we had that beautiful Capitol building, long time ago, the first Capitol, I think, was in Cahaba or some of those St. Stephen's. It was then moved to Huntsville, Alabama, then to Tuscaloosa, and then it came to Montgomery, where it has been all these years. There couldn't be a more beautiful setting on a hill facing the main street in town, Dexter Avenue. It is, to me, a sight to see. Long time ago, when even goats and cattle grazed on the Capitol ground, they called the Capitol Goat Hill. I don't hear that said very much nowadays, but it was Goat Hill. In history, it was depicted as Goat Hill. I loved the Capitol, and it is growing, of course, by leaps and bounds. The time will come, perhaps, when they will condense a lot of the offices, and perhaps they should do that. The early years that I was there were just delightful for me. As you can see, that I certainly enjoyed the work. In fact, every job that I ever had, I loved my work. And I continue to think of things that happened in the Secretary of State's office. We handled many things. We would sell the law books. That was part of the duty of the Secretary of State's office. We handled the elections. We had every corporation doing business of the state of Alabama must file papers in the Secretary of State's office. They have now, of course, made improvements, computer systems, but when I was first elected Secretary of State, we were using the same books, the leather-bound books, containing information. Nothing has been changed, hadn't been changed in 100 years until the time that I felt, since I felt I should merit the trust the people had placed in me by electing me Secretary of State, I went to the legislature and I told them the condition of the records. Using the same records of corporation books, we'd have to turn page by page from an index to find the information people wanted by telephone, long distance. We'd even have to tell them we'll call you back to look it up for them. And I told the legislature, I said, we have typewriters. Let us have a more modern method of handling the corporation records. And they gave us a small amount of money, filing cabinets, and said we could get the clerks from the governor's temporary clerk hire fund. And we changed those, transposed those names to just a card index system that would take the space of just a filing cabinet and doing away with those unsightly leather-bound books, dog-eared, and the ink was faded, but we would get the proper information. When I was first elected, I've always been economy-minded, and gentlemen had usually held the offices before. They were moving the mansion from the location on Grove and Perry Street further down to that beautiful General Ligon home. And I called the governor's office to ask if we could have the drapes that were used in the governor's mansion to put in the Secretary of State's office. They did, and we placed them there because later we've had beautiful drapes and better furniture. But those things are memories for me in the Secretary of State's office. In later years, in fact, one of the terms that I served as Secretary of State, of course, at that time, we couldn't succeed ourselves, and we would run to another office, and I had the good fortune to get by without opposition for the office of State Auditor. Then I was elected State Treasurer after that, and then I came back to the Secretary of State's office, and it was during that term that the legislature had passed what is known as the Uniform Commercial Code law. And that is, takes up a good space in the Secretary of State's office. We have spread out. We have offices in the State Office building. That was where we had the Uniform Commercial Code, later the corporation records of the land divisions, the land division. But the effectiveness of the Uniform Commercial Code has been very good. It's well received by people of the state. The Uniform Commercial Code provides that the Secretary of State's office keep a record of conditional sales contracts and mortgages that are necessary, and we get calls, but we have to get authentic telephone calls to get the information about mortgages and conditional sales contracts. That was an additional item that was placed in the Secretary of State's office.
Can you tell us a little bit of maintained? For example, was it clean? Was it well taken care of that you recall during your years there?
I never found fault with the cleanliness of the Capitol grounds. We had a landscape gardener. We had guards outside. We had everything to make the Capitol acceptable to the public eye. And I think that's one reason why we have so many tourists from many places coming to the Capitol. And wonderful remarks have been made by the people who have visited the Capitol.
Tom was telling me that the janitorial crew used to get up early in the morning and keep it spick and span.
Do you remember much about the janitorial system at that time? Was it inmates, do you recall?
You mean the service we had to use the porters that we had?
The porters, but cleaning the building, how was it?
That was done by convict labor. They were brought in from the prison, from Kilby Prison. An interesting point is we never used robbers, we used murderers in prison, because the robbers would take money from the latest purses and whatever they could put their hands on. We didn't use robbers. And one interesting story, we had a porter one time, and I just somehow thought he had robbed somebody. He was a nice fellow, but he was a convict. And I said, Joe, who did you rob? And he said, no, I didn't rob anybody. I just killed somebody.
Was the Secretary of State's office in the same place all the times that you...
As long as I was there, it was across the hall from the governor's office, and it is necessary that it be in close proximity to the governor's office, because no official act of the governor is official. No act of the governor is official without the signature of the Secretary of State and the annexation of the seal. So we have to be in close proximity to the governor. Now, that doesn't sound very important, but it certainly is, because any act that the governor, any proclamation, whatever he issues, is not illegal unless it has the signature of the Secretary of State and the annexation of the seal. Many stories are told about the seal. All they do is handle the Great Seal. Well, that certainly is not so. I can vouch for that. The trademarks that we have, there's a law that people who wish to protect that trademark, they file it with the Office of Secretary of State. A lot of filing is done there. A lot of effective work is done in the Supreme Court. They had an opening as the assistant clerk to Judge Thomas, and I was called to come down for an interview. And I said, well, I don't come to you with references. They said, you don't need them. We know you. I spent 3.5 happy years in the Supreme Court. At the end of my 3.5 years, my husband had passed away. He was killed in an automobile accident. And then I immediately began running for Secretary of State. But in the Supreme Court, there's a lot of activity going on, particularly on Decisions Day. The judges have they have rendered these decisions, and they are distributed from the clerk's office. The reporters are there to get information. Interesting cases. There was an impeachment proceeding. A sheriff in Walker County, impeachment proceedings had begun against him, and they were held in the Supreme Court. And time meant nothing to us. We worked late in the night and writing up the subpoenas and all of those things necessary for the hearings. And a famous lawyer in Birmingham, Roderick Beto, was always known, if you're guilty, get Roderick Beto as your attorney, and he was there. And then he came out from the hearing with his mane of hair falling down over, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. He had won the case. While I was assistant clerk of the court, my boss was ill a few times, and when court was to be held in session, I began to let it, of course, be known that as his assistant, I should handle the docket in the Supreme Court at the hearing. And I was getting things together. Judge Lucian Gardner was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a wonderful, wonderful gentleman, but he was not used to women aspiring for higher things. And he called me to his office, and he says, do you want to call the docket? And I said, yes, I do. I said, I feel that that's my job to do if my boss is not here. And they'd always let the librarian call the docket. He said, well, all right. And I did. But I lived to rue the day. I lived to rue the day. The Supreme Court filed in after the library yelled out, hear ye, hear ye, the Supreme Court of Alabama in session. They come in with the robes and they sit. And I began to call the docket. They had a case. Charlie Rowe was the attorney presenting, and it was a case that was to be argued and submitted. We got many cases that in the clerk's office just submitted on brief, and our filing pad the stamp would be SOB. It was always SOB for the submitted on brief. And the argued and submitted were A&S. So Charlie Rowe from Elba, Alabama, good lawyer, he presented this case. It was the worst sex case that was ever presented to the Supreme Court. And I sat there writing just like I had so much to do with my head bowed, never looked up. And later they said, you asked for it. You asked for it. That was an interesting episode in the Supreme Court, but those judges were delightful.
Were you the only lady in the courtroom at the time? Were
What?
you the only lady in the courtroom?
Only lady in the court.
Must have been an excruciating.
That was interesting. I think that I've told people all over that next to the Secretary of State's office and the State Treasurer, the Supreme Court is the nicest place in the world to work.
What did the Supreme Court change? Was it in the Capitol at that time?
No, it was in the old Shriners building. When it left the main Capitol building, it had to have more space. The Court of Appeals, the Attorney General's office. They moved to the old Shriners building. It was done over.
Do you remember the old court in the Capitol building before it moved?
Well, yes, because I was at an early age, and the Supreme Court was where the purchasing department or the finance department was located before it moved.
What did the room look like when it was in the Capitol?
Well, I didn't visit it enough to really tell you sufficient about it to know what it looked like. But of course, they were the austere. This was the Supreme Court of everything. It had to be the best, I thought.
The judges' offices were on the second floor, weren't they?
Wherever they were, I believe at that time the Court of Appeals must have been on the second or third floor. I don't remember, but the Supreme Court, of course, the highest court in the state of Alabama.
Was the library directly back of the courtroom?
Close to it, yes. Interesting people have been there.
You must have really been revolutionary to be the first woman to run for office in Alabama, and I think that would be something to...
I was not the first. Now, getting back to history, the first woman elected to the legislature was not Miss Sybil Poole. The first woman elected to the legislature was Mrs. Hattie Hooker Wilkins from Selma. I depicted her in a pageant one time, dressed like I thought she would have been dressed. She was elected in 1922. She served for 4 years and did not choose to run again. Then, that was in 1922. And the early years, maybe the early 30s, Sybil Poole was elected to the legislature for 3 terms. And then later she was appointed Secretary of State. And then she served, she was elected then and served 4 years and went to the Treasurer's office and then went to the Public Service Commission. I would be the second woman to hold state office, but I'm I guess, the only one to serve for 30 years, holding office one to another. Mm-hmm.
But you were the first one for statewide election.
No, Sybil Poole would have been the first.
She was
statewide?
Statewide.
Yeah, she was the first.
Okay.
Sybil Poole, and then I succeeded her.
I see.
What am I trying to say? Something there that I...
How did men receive a woman in the kind of office as
Well, when
Secretary
I
of
would
State?
campaign, very few people objected. I traveled. I worked at running for public office. I loved every minute of it, the good and the bad. I loved running for public office. Like George Wallace, he just likes to run. But I wanted to prove my worth by making improvements or whatever I could do in the various offices. But campaigning over the state and the interesting things that happen. People are kind, and the first time I ran, I reached Wilcox County. My husband grew up in Wilcox County. and Camden, and they all said, and that in surrounding counties, Marengo County, my mother-in-law knew a lot of people, and they said, when you get elected, come back to see us. Well, I went back to see them, and they said, well, very seldom do we have people to come back to thank us, which I did, but I took Ms. Baggett down there, and then they asked me to be on radio. Television was quite new at that time. I don't know that I could have run for office because I wouldn't have had the money to have spent for a great amount of television. I only spent $2,400 getting elected the first time for Secretary of State. But they had me on radio, and I remember just so clearly, I told them that what a beautiful state this is, from the tip of Mobile to the far north, to all across to the eastern part, down through all these areas. They're just beautiful. I said the lakes in Marshall County, the beautiful Fairhope in South Alabama. I was talking about the state of Alabama, and I have continued to find beautiful spots in the state of Alabama, the glorious state parks that we have. I serve on the state board of the retired state employees, and we had a convention in North Alabama at the Gunnersville State Park, and they always want me to tell stories of things that happen, and that young women will get around me, tell us some more, Ms. Baggett, tell us what you did when you'd run for office. The people were universally kind. Even in Choctaw County, Washington County, I stopped a few people in front of the courthouse, and I handed my card, and I said, I'd like you to vote for me. And one man there said, well, I can't vote for you, Miss Baggett. You didn't do something I want you to do, and he tore up my card. And I said to the gentleman, I said, gentleman, he's referring to asking me to make an appointment for him, but I had asked someone else, and I know he wouldn't want me to go back on my word. They said, Ms. Baggett, don't you pay attention to him. We're going to vote for you. Same thing happened in North Alabama. I saw some people in front of a bank, and I handed my card, and this man said again, Ms. Baggett, I can't vote for you. I asked you to do a favor for me, and you refused. And I just said, well, thank you. And I walked in the bank, and I could see from a plate glass window these people to the side, and I said, who are those nice gentlemen out there? I couldn't remember the man who said he was not going to vote for me. They told me, then I knew exactly why he said what he did. You know, we also, in one of the offices, the state auditor's office, and I served there 4 years, we have what's called a board of compromise. That is where the state has claims against people for back taxes or something, and if it's fair, we don't ask that the taxes be paid, but if the taxes should be paid, we ask for them and recommend that the taxes be paid, and that was what the gentleman was talking about, that he had a claim there, and these people, he was representing them and didn't think they ought to pay the taxes, and we denied his claim. Well, in the next little town, the three counties, the Tri-Cities, I met this gentleman. Well, he had been very kind to me. I was running for the office of state treasurer at that time. And I told him, he says, what can I do for you? Just what can I do for you? So I told him this story. And he says, you just let me handle this. He says, I'll write him a letter. He wrote him a letter, and he said, I have a dear friend who's running for the office of state treasurer. I'm doing everything I can to help her, and I want you to do the same. He said that man had wanted him to do something for him. He said, I want you to help her. And so that ended that little episode.
You said you were going to tell us a little bit about your philosophy for other people running for office.
I do. I say this to young people today, anyone who wishes, who has ambition and aspiration to hold public office. I feel that that if you, speaking directly to someone, if you are ambitious to be Secretary of State or State Auditor, State Treasurer, Governor, Lieutenant Governor,